Welcome back to another episode of Mike Reads. Tonight we'll be continuing in our series on Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson with Chapter 11, Who's Protected by Tariffs. As I've mentioned throughout the course of this series, we are doing this series as a parallel read with Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies, so I'll put a link to that series in this video's description. As I've also mentioned throughout the course of this series, we'll be doing an analysis and review at the end of each read, so I'll put a timestamp in this video's description to the analysis and review part of the video. So you can just jump straight to that if that's how you'd like to go about this. Chapter 11 is a very long read, and it will be a long time in this book before we get to a read quite this long, so you'll have to bear with me. Also, because of its length, Hazlitt has broken up this chapter into several parts. He hasn't actually labeled part 1 as part 1, so I'm going to have to add that into the read. And I think that's a reasonable thing to do because the sections are just numerically broken up. It's just 1, 2, 3, 4. There's no labels to the sections. So since this is a long read, let's go ahead and dive right on into it then with tonight's read, which is Chapter 11, Who's Protected by Tariffs? Part 1. A mere recital of the economic policies of governments all over the world is calculated to cause any serious student of economics to throw up his hands in despair. What possible point can there be, he is likely to ask, in discussing refinements and advances in economic theory when popular thought and the actual policies of governments, certainly in everything connected with international relations, have not yet caught up with Adam Smith? For present-day tariff and trade policies are not only as bad as those in the 17th and 18th centuries, but incomparably worse. The real reasons for those tariffs and other trade barriers are the same, and the pretended reasons are also the same. Since the Wealth of Nations appeared more than 2 centuries ago, the case for free trade has been stated thousands of times, but perhaps never with more direct simplicity and force than it was stated in that volume. In general, Smith rested his case on one fundamental proposition. Quote, "In every country, it is always and must be the interest of the great body of the people to buy whatever they want of those who sell it cheapest. The proposition is so very manifest," Smith continues, "that it seems ridiculous to take any pains to prove it, nor could it ever have been called in question had not the interested sophistry of merchants and manufacturers confounded the common sense of mankind." End quote. From another point of view, free trade was considered as one aspect of the specialization of labor. Quote, "It is the maxim of every prudent master of a family never to attempt to make at home what it will cost him more to make than to buy. The tailor does not attempt to make his own shoes, but buys them of the shoemaker. The shoemaker does not attempt to make his own clothes, but employs a tailor. The farmer attempts to make neither one nor the other, but employs those different artificers. All of them find it for their interest to employ their whole industry in a way in which they have some advantage over their neighbors, and to purchase with a part of its produce, what is the same thing, the price of a part of it, whatever else they have occasion for. What is prudence in the conduct of every private family can scarce be folly in that of a great kingdom." End quote. But whatever led people to suppose that what was prudence in the conduct of every private family could be folly in that of a great kingdom? It was a whole network of fallacies out of which mankind has still been unable to cut its way. And the chief of them was the central fallacy with which this book is concerned. It was that of considering merely the immediate effects of a tariff on special groups and neglecting to consider its long-run effects on the whole community. Part 2. An American manufacturer of woolen sweaters goes to Congress or to the State Department and tells the committee or officials concerned that it would be a national disaster to remove or reduce the tariff on British sweaters. He now sells his sweaters for $30 each, but English manufacturers could sell their sweaters of the same quality for $25. A duty of $5, therefore, is needed to keep him in business. He's not thinking of himself, of course, but of the thousands of men and women he employs, and of the people to whom their spending in turn gives employment. Throw them out of work, and you create unemployment and a fall in purchasing power, which would spread in ever-widening circles. And if you can prove that he really would be forced out of business if the tariff were removed or reduced, his argument against that action is regarded by Congress as conclusive. But the fallacy comes from looking merely at this manufacturer and his employees, or merely at the American sweater industry. It comes from noticing only the results that are immediately seen and neglecting the results that are not seen because they are prevented from coming into existence. The lobbyists for tariff protection are continually putting forward arguments that are not factually correct. But let us assume that the facts in this case are precisely as the sweater manufacturer stated them. Let us assume that a tariff of $5 a sweater is necessary for him to stay in business and provide employment at sweater making for his workers. We have deliberately chosen the most unfavorable example of any for the removal of a tariff. We have not taken an argument for the imposition of a new tariff in order to bring a new industry into existence, but an argument for the retention of a tariff that has already brought an industry into existence and cannot be repealed without hurting somebody. The tariff is repealed. The manufacturer goes out of business. 1,000 workers are laid off. The particular tradesmen whom they patronized are hurt. This is the immediate result that is seen. But there are also results which, while much more difficult to trace, are no less immediate and no less real. For now, sweaters that formerly cost $30 apiece can be bought for $25. Consumers can now buy the same quality of sweater for less money, or a much better one for the same money. If they buy the same quality of sweater, they not only get the sweater, but they have $5 left over, which they would not have had under the previous conditions to buy something else. With the $25 that they pay for the imported sweater, they help employment, as the American manufacturer no doubt predicted, in the sweater industry in England. With the $5 left over, they help employment in any number of other industries in the United States. But the results do not end there. By buying English sweaters, they furnish the English with dollars to buy American goods here. This, in fact, if I may here disregard such complications as fluctuating exchange rates, loans, credits, etc., is the only way in which the British can eventually make use of these dollars. Because we have permitted the British to sell more to us, they are now able to buy more from us. They are, in fact, eventually forced to buy more from us if their dollar balances are not to remain perpetually unused. So as a result of letting in more British goods, we must export more American goods. And though fewer people are now employed in the American sweater industry, more people are employed, and much more efficiently employed, in, say, the American washing machine or aircraft building business. American employment on net balance has not gone down, but American and British production on net balance has gone up. Labor in each country is more fully employed in doing just those things that it does best, instead of being forced to do things that it does inefficiently or badly. Consumers in both countries are better off. They're able to buy what they want where they can get it cheapest. American consumers are provided with sweaters, and British consumers are better provided with washing machines and aircraft. Part 3. Now let us look at the matter on the other way around. Now let us look at the matter the other way around and see the effect of imposing a tariff in the first place. Suppose there had been no tariff on foreign knit goods, that Americans were accustomed to buying foreign sweaters without duty, and that the argument were then put forward that we could bring a sweater industry into existence by imposing a duty of $5 on sweaters. There would be nothing logically wrong with this argument so far as it went. The cost of British sweaters to the American consumer might therefore be forced so high that the American manufacturers would find it profitable to enter the sweater business. But American consumers would be forced to subsidize this industry. On every American sweater they bought, they would be forced in effect to pay a tax of $5, which would be collected from them in a higher price by the new sweater industry. Americans would be employed in a sweater industry who had not previously been employed in a sweater industry. That much is true. But there would be no net addition to the country's industry or the country's employment. Because the American consumer had to pay $5 more for the same quality of sweater, it would have just that much less left over to buy anything else. He would have to reduce his expenditures by $5 somewhere else. In order that one industry might grow or come into existence, 100 other industries would have to shrink. In order that 50,000 persons might be employed in the woolen sweater industry, 50,000 fewer persons would be employed elsewhere. But the new industry would be visible. The number of its employees, the capital invested in it, the market value of its product in terms of dollars could be easily counted. The neighbors could see the sweater workers going to and from the factory every day. The results would be palpable and direct. But the shrinkage of 100 other industries, the loss of 50,000 other jobs somewhere else, would not be so easily noticed. It would be impossible for even the cleverest statistician to know precisely what the incidence of the loss of other jobs had been, precisely how many men and women had been laid off from each particular industry, precisely how much business each particular industry had lost, because consumers had to pay more for their sweaters. For a loss spread among all the other productive activities of the country would be comparatively minute for each. It would be impossible for anyone to know precisely how each consumer would have spent his extra $5 if he had been allowed to retain it. The overwhelming majority of the people, therefore, would probably suffer from the illusion that the new industry had cost us nothing. Part 4. It is important to notice that the new tariff on sweaters would not raise American wages. To be sure, it would enable Americans to work in the sweater industry at approximately the average level of American wages for workers of their skill, instead of having to compete in that industry at the British level of wages. But there would be no increase in American wages in general as a result of the duty, for as we have seen, there would be no net increase in the number of jobs provided, no net increase in the demand for goods, and no increase in labor productivity. Labor productivity would, in fact, be reduced as a result of the tariff. And this brings us to the real effect of a tariff wall. It is not merely that all its visible gains are offset by less obvious but no real losses. It results, in fact, in a net loss to the country. For contrary to centuries of interested propaganda and disinterested confusion, the tariff reduces the American level of wages. Let us observe more clearly how it does this. We have seen that the added amount which consumers pay for a tariff-protected article leaves them just that much less with which to buy all other articles. There is here no net gain to industry as a whole. But as a result of the artificial barrier erected against foreign goods, American labor, capital and land are deflected from what they can do more efficiently to what they do less efficiently. Therefore, as a result of the tariff wall, the average productivity of American labor and capital is reduced. If you look at it now from the consumer's point of view, we find that he can buy less with his money. Because he has to pay more for sweaters and other protected goods, he can buy less of everything else. The general purchasing power of his income has therefore been reduced. Whether the net effect of the tariff is to lower money wages or to raise money prices will depend upon the monetary policies that are followed. But what is clear is that the tariff, though it may increase wages above what they would have been in the protected industry, must on net balance, when all occupations considered, reduce real wages, reduce them, that is to say, compared with what they otherwise would have been. Only minds corrupted by generations of misleading propaganda can regard this conclusion as paradoxical. What other result could we expect from a policy of deliberately using our resources of capital and manpower in less efficient ways than we know how to use them? What other result could we expect from deliberately erecting artificial obstacles to trade and transportation? For the erection of terrorist walls has the same effect as the erection of real walls. It is significant that the protectionists habitually use the language of warfare. They talk of, quote-unquote, repelling an invasion of foreign products. And the means they suggest in the fiscal field are like those of the battlefield. The tariff barriers that are put up to repel this invasion are like the tank traps, trenches, and barbed wire entanglements created to repel or slow down attempted invasion by a foreign army. And just as the foreign army is compelled to employ more expensive means to surmount those obstacles, bigger tanks, mine detectors, engineer corps to cut wire, forge streams, and build bridges, so more expensive and efficient transportation means must be developed to surmount tariff obstacles. On the one hand, we try to reduce the cost of transportation between England and America or Canada and the United States by developing faster and more efficient planes and ships, better roads and bridges, better locomotives and motor trucks. On the other hand, we offset this investment in efficient transportation by a tariff that makes it commercially even more difficult to transport goods than it was before. We make it $1 cheaper to ship the sweaters and then increase the tariff by $2 to prevent the sweater from being shipped. By reducing the freight that can be profitably carried, we reduce the value of the investment in transportation and efficiency. Part 5. The tariff has been described as a means of benefiting the producer at the expense of the consumer. In a sense, this is correct. Those who favor it think only of the interests of the producers immediately benefited by the particular duties involved. They forget the interests of the consumers who are immediately injured by being forced to pay these duties. But it is wrong to think of the tariff issue as if it represented a conflict between the interests of producers as a unit against those of consumers as a unit. It is true that the tariff hurts all consumers as such. It is not true that it benefits all producers as such. On the contrary, as we have just seen, it helps protected producers at the expense of all other American producers, and particularly those who have a comparatively larger potential export market. We can perhaps make this last point clear by an exaggerated example. Suppose we make our tariff wall so high that it becomes absolutely prohibitive, and no imports come in from the outside world at all. Suppose, as a result of this, that the price of sweaters in America goes up only $5. Then American consumers, because they have to pay $5 more for a sweater, will spend on average 5 cents less in each of 100 other American industries. The figures are chosen merely to illustrate a principle. There will, of course, be no such symmetrical distribution of the loss. Moreover, the sweater industry itself will doubtless be hurt because of the protection of still other industries, but these complications may be put aside for the moment. Now, because foreign industries will find their market in America totally cut off, they will get no dollar exchange and therefore will be unable to buy any American goods at all. As a result of this, American industries will suffer in direct proportion to the percentage of their sales previously made abroad. Those that will be most injured in the first instance will be such industries as raw cotton producers, copper producers, makers of sewing machines, agricultural machinery, typewriters, commercial airplanes, and so on. A higher tariff wall, which, however, is not prohibitive, will produce the same kind of results as this, but merely to a smaller degree. The effect of a tariff, therefore, is to change the structure of American production. It changes the number of occupations, the kind of occupations, and the relative size of one industry as compared with another. It makes the industries in which we are comparatively inefficient larger, and the industries in which we are comparatively efficient smaller. Its net effect, therefore, is to reduce American efficiency, as well as to reduce efficiency in the countries with which we would otherwise have traded more largely. In the long run, notwithstanding the mountains of arguments pro and con, a tariff is irrelevant to the question of employment. True, sudden changes in the tariff, either upward or downward, can create temporary unemployment, as they force corresponding changes in the structure of production. Such sudden changes can even cause a depression. But a tariff is not irrelevant to the question of wages. In the long run, it always reduces real wages because it reduces efficiency, production, and wealth. Thus, all the chief tariff fallacies stem from the central fallacy with which this book is concerned. They are the result of looking only at the immediate effects of a single tariff rate on one group of producers, and forgetting the long-run effects both on consumers as a whole and on all other producers. I hear some reader asking, why not solve this by giving tariff protection to all producers? But the fallacy here is that this cannot help producers uniformly and cannot help at all domestic producers who are already, quote-unquote, outsell foreign producers. These efficient producers must necessarily suffer from the diversion of purchasing power brought about by the tariff. Part 6. On the subject of the tariff, we must keep in mind one final precaution. It is the same precaution that we found necessary in examining the effects of machinery. It is useless to deny that a tariff does benefit, or at least can benefit, special interests. True, it benefits them at the expense of everyone else, but it does benefit them. If one industry alone could get protection, while its owners and workers enjoyed the benefits of free trade and everything else they bought, that industry would benefit even on net balance. As an attempt is made to extend the tariff blessings, however, even people in protected industries, both as producers and consumers, begin to suffer from other people's protection, and may finally be worse off even on net balance than if neither they nor anyone else had protection. But we should not deny, as enthusiastic free traders have so often done, the possibility of these tariff benefits to special groups. We should not pretend, for example, that a reduction of the tariff would help everybody and hurt nobody. It is true that its reduction would help the country on net balance. But somebody would be hurt. Groups previously enjoying high protection would be hurt. That, in fact, is one reason why it is not good to bring such protected interests into existence in the first place. But clarity and candor of thinking compel us to see and acknowledge that some industries are right when they say that a removal of the tariff on their product would throw them out of business and throw their workers, at least temporarily, out of jobs. And if their workers had developed specialized skills, they may even suffer permanently, or until they have at long last learnt equal skills. In tracing the effects of tariffs, as in tracing the effects of machinery, we should endeavor to see all the chief effects, in both the short run and the long run, on all groups. As a postscript to this chapter, I should add that its argument is not directed against all tariffs, including duties collected mainly for revenue, or to keep alive industries needed for war, nor is it directed against all arguments for tariffs. It is merely directed against the fallacy that a tariff on net balance, quote-unquote, provides employment, raises wages, or, again, quote-unquote, protects the American standard of living. It does none of these things, and so far as wages and the standard of living are concerned, it does the precise opposite. But an examination of duties imposed for other purposes would carry us beyond our present subject. Nor need we here examine the effect of import quotas, exchange controls, bilateralism, and other means of reducing, diverting, or preventing international trade. Such devices have, in general, the same effects as higher prohibitive tariffs, and often worse effects. They present more complicated issues, but their net results can be traced through the same kind of reasoning that we have just applied to tariff barriers. All right, that concludes the read. Now on to the analysis and review part of the video. All right, welcome to the analysis and review part of the video. So this chapter begins a series on commodities exchange and foreign markets in this book. This is by far the most complicated part of the read and of the book in general, and the fallacies that he's introducing are the most difficult ones, not only to debunk, but also to explain. But they are fallacies nonetheless, and Hazlitt actually does an okay job of debunking them. I think he would need to go into greater detail than he does. However, the book is only 200 and something pages long, and this is intended to be an introductory lesson in economics. This is starting to get into more of beginner economics rather than novice or introductory economics. So if it was difficult for you guys to understand what he was getting at, understand that this is probably as complex as this read is going to get. He's also going to get into more straightforward and understandable and more what I would consider meaningful reads when it comes to debunking these fallacies and, of course, and when it comes to introducing somebody who knows nothing about economics to the world of economics. He will eventually get back to that. It's about 4 or 5 chapters of commodities exchange and foreign markets. So you'll have to bear with us as we go through this section. But with this read, he's basically introducing the topic. He's basically introducing the reader to these more complex issues. And to be honest, the read boils down to just the basics of trade. And he does actually acknowledge that basically everything that he's going to discuss is something that, Adam Smith covered in The Wealth of Nations. Again, I'll put a link in this video's description to that series because I did read this on this channel. And Smith actually does a great job, although he does a great job of explaining this fallacy, although Smith's version of explaining this fallacy is like this long and is hundreds of pages long. And it's a definitely very complete, if not needlessly verbose, explanation of this fallacy. And it's a fallacy that Smith covered 250 years ago. And to be quite honest, he could have just copy and pasted book 1 of The Wealth of Nations to do this. But again, I understand that this is supposed to be an introductory read, and it's supposed to be boiling down certain fallacies to the original fallacy of the broken window fallacy. And the idea behind the entire fallacy can be summed up and refuted in basically one quote that he extracts from Smith, which he inserts into page 74. In general, Smith rested his case on one fundamental proposition, quote, "In every country, it is always and must be the interest of the great body of the people to buy whatever they want of those who sells it cheapest," end quote. And that's obviously true. That's in fact axiomatically true, as we know from the world, because it is an extension of Smith's lesson, and that the way we know what somebody wants is to allow them to make those decisions about what they want and what the value of that exchange would be by allowing them to determine what the value of that exchange would be. And this is where we get the idea of consent and mutual consent within transactions. It's also kind of obviously true. If you have 2 gas stations that are right next to each other on the same road, all things otherwise being equal, the gas station that sells their gas for a penny cheaper is going to be completely out of gas, and the other gas station is not going to be able to sell a drop of it. We all know this. And this is just the basics of the law of demand, which I go into a little bit further detail in a video I did on the law of demand, which also covers another topic as well. I'll put a link in this video's description to that video, which is on my other channel. I think you guys will really like it. So why not put that video? Why not put that video in the description of this video as well? Honestly, he could have, for this chapter and for this part of this chapter, part 1. He could have easily just said C. Smith for the entire section, as far as the why this is the case and how this is the case. But again, it is really just an extension of Smith's lesson, that the most effective way to allocate scarce resources is with prices that arise as a result of mutually consensual transactions, and they arise naturally. Smith goes into, again, great detail as to the explanation of where currency comes from and where prices come from. Hazlitt doesn't really touch on that in this chapter. He does touch on it in a later chapter, which we will eventually get to. Smith spends basically all of book 1 explaining just that. He does of all of the things that Smith does in The Wealth of Nations, that is the thing he does best. But the lesson to get out of chapter 11 here and the read we did today is that tariffs always economically hurt the home economy. So when we institute a tariff on, I'll say it, China, we wind up paying for that. Yeah, China might too, but we do wind up paying for that. If we institute a tariff on Canada, on their milk, then we wind up paying the cost of that tariff. And, the way that that is paid, of course, is that, and as Hazlitt explains, if we wind up paying in the domestic market more for milk because we can't import it for cheaper, then we'll wind up paying the domestic market more for that milk. And again, if we were without the governmental interference with mutually consensual transactions, if we were more willing to import that milk from Canada, then obviously we are better suited as a country, and axiomatically, we are better suited as consumers to be allowed to make those decisions. And again, this is the extension of Smith's lesson. And I talked about interference, which doesn't have to come from government, but we talked about interference in my series on interference. Again, I'll link to that series in this video's description. This kind of further extends into the fallacy of trade imbalances. And I should put those in scare quotes because a trade imbalance really kind of isn't a thing, because if we get their goods, they get our money. If they get our goods, we get their money. And since this would be, I guess, in a market economy, be carried about through mutually consensual transaction, obviously the party that would rather have the good is going to get the good. Obviously, the party that would rather have the money is going to get the money. And obviously, the exchange would not happen if both parties didn't think that they were of at least equal value. In fact, the exchange axiomatically wouldn't happen unless both parties thought that they were winning as a result of the transaction. And as you keep having all of these wins, if you keep allowing all of these wins, everybody winds up winning. And Hazlitt actually explains that on page 77. Let me see where. Oh, no, he's actually going to go on. Sorry. So the trade imbalance goes one step further here. It's not only is it just that both sides win. What happens to money? Let's say if we import something from England, what happens to that money once England has it? Well, Hazlitt really doesn't do a very good job of explaining this, but I'll give you his explanation and I'll expand upon that. By buying English, this is on page 77, by buying English sweaters, they furnish the English with dollars to buy American goods here. This is the only way in which the British can eventually make use of these dollars. What does that mean? So we have American dollars. That's all we have. And we want British linens. So we send our American dollars, because that's all we have, to British linens, and that's all they have is the British linens. And they send us the linens. I realize I'm kind of being a bit reductionist here and talking about a transaction kind of happening in a bit of a vacuum, but it's the same. The point is the same. What happens to those American dollars? Are they able to buy their own goods with American dollars? No. They're in England. Their American dollars are worth almost nothing. In fact, they would have to exchange the American dollars for the British currency. They'd have to find somebody who's willing to give you fewer British pounds sterling than they would American dollars, or at least the equivalent thereof. For example, if it's a loaf of bread's worth of American dollars, it would be less than a loaf of bread's worth of British pound sterling to make the exchange. Otherwise, obviously, they wouldn't make the exchange. The other thing that they could do with those American dollars is buy our goods. So the more American dollars that they have gained through mutually consensual transactions, the more goods they can and obviously then do import. This is something that Smith does a great job of explaining in book 1 of The Wealth of Nations, exactly how that happens, and how even if they don't spend it in the American market, if they use those American dollars to buy wine in France, then now France has those American dollars, and eventually somebody's going to have to circulate those American dollars back into the U.S. to buy our goods. They don't just vanish into the ether, and nobody is just going to stuff them literally under their mattress. Or literally set fire to them like the Joker from Dark Knight. And yeah, so that's what happens to those dollars once they have it. So the notion of there being a trade imbalance, if you will, is kind of a moot point. And he does go into explaining, where are we? Page 77? Yeah. Okay, so the why for all of this. The why is this bad? And why is it that this winds up being a net positive to conduct this trade? Hazlitt explains this on page 77. And though fewer people are now employed in the American sweater industry, more people are employed and much more efficiently employed in, say, the American washing machine or aircraft building businesses. So this is what we talked about when it comes to the mutually consensual exchanges. This is something that isn't exactly easy to see, which we'll get into in just a second. But the point is, if we're making more, if we would rather spend our money making aircraft or washing machines, then we would rather spend our money making aircraft or washing machines. This is an axiomatic truth. And he mentioned this in the previous read, which I should probably link in this video. Well, you guys have probably seen it, but I'll put a link in this video's description as well. That the idea here is about productivity. What is going to maximize our productivity for the net dollar produced? Well, if we're really efficient here in the United States at making aircraft, and the British are really good at efficient at making linens, then our money, the comparative advantage that we have, is in making aircraft and washing machines. So we should make aircraft and washing machines. In that way, we as a society have a competitive edge because we have allocated our scarce resources in the most efficient and effective way. So this is something that is a very commonly pervaded fallacy on actually both sides of the political aisle, if you will. If you allow me, folks, to get a little bit political, I think that this is a fallacy that Donald Trump in the beginning of his tenure either didn't understand or continues to not quite understand when it comes to the imposition of tariffs. That if there is in a market environment, a country that we are importing more goods in terms of the actual number of goods than we are exporting, that's something we really shouldn't care about. If there are jobs that are in a market economy, are leaving our country and going to a foreign country simply because it makes more sense for us to be doing other things. Again, the manufacture of linens, we basically don't do that here in the United States. Now, I realize we don't have a perfect market economy. If we had a perfect market economy, you'd have things, you wouldn't have things like minimum wage, which may allow certain people who aren't as productive otherwise to have jobs in the linen industry, because that's where they might actually be able to find work. And yes, I'm talking about, say, like teenagers who might need their first job, and they don't have any work experience, but they want to go out and work a few hours a week after school, maybe working in something having to do with linens. The linen industry would be beneficial as long as they could work cheap enough for the linen industry to bother to hire them. So, again, if you allow me to get just political for just a little bit of it. So why is this fallacy so common? Why do we see this fallacy on both sides of the proverbial political aisle and basically everywhere? And the answer in short term is visibility. So when we're talking about visibility, we're talking about the economics and business term in actually finance to a lesser degree, which is called visibility. Hazlitt does a great job of explaining basically what this is on page 78. But the new industry would be visible. The neighbors could see the sweater workers going to and from the factory every day. So in the case of a factory that goes out of business, because we've lifted a tariff on the importation of foreign goods, they go out of business, let's say, and they lose the jobs. It's very easy to see the people that are going to and from that work. It's very easy to see that business close its physical doors. It's not very easy to see 1,000 people, 1,000 different companies over the course of the entire country getting one extra job. It's difficult to see that, but it's very easy to see one business losing all 1,000 of its employees and going completely out of business. It's very difficult to see a minor increase in the price of all goods compared to a substantial increase or decrease in price in one good, even though it might actually be to our net benefit in the end with a decrease in prices of all other goods. So that's the concept of visibility. I'd love to do a video on strictly that. I don't think this is probably the channel to do that. And visibility the lesson of visibility does extend a bit beyond that. So I guess I don't know if I'll have time to do that, but if you guys have a chance to look into it, there is a business term called visibility. It's something I highly recommend to do as an addendum to this read. There are some fallacies that stem from this. He goes on through the rest of the read to go over what they are. The main one that I care to focus my time on, because there are kind of a lot of them that he touches up on some minor fallacies to go over, is the notion of wages. So he talks about this very generally on page 79. It's important to notice the new tariff sweaters would not raise American wages. To be sure, it would enable Americans to work in the sweater industry at approximately the average level of American wages. Okay, why is that the case? The reason that's the case is because when you don't have a mutually consensual transaction, when you have an interference with that, when you have an arbitrary decision to switch jobs from one position to another, what you wind up doing is you don't increase productivity. In fact, you do the exact opposite. And remember, this is the lesson we talked about earlier, and it's the lesson from the previous read that I've linked to in this video's description, which is that we're looking to maximize productivity per unit of input, whatever that unit of input is. And if we're doing things that at net balance decrease the net productivity per dollar spent, which is axiomatically true in this case, then what winds up happening is that the total dollar amount of that productivity shrinks, which means the exchange for the labor, which is that productivity, must at net balance also shrink, because the value of that net labor has shrunk. What that means is that although, and he actually does get this slightly wrong, because in this case, there may be an element of unemployment that is created at net balance because jobs are being shifted from one industry to another. And that's all that's happening. The job is just shifting from one industry to another. The labor at net balance is shifting from one industry to another. And in doing so, instead of having 1,000 people employed, you may have 900 people employed. And their hourly wage on average might actually be less, might actually be more. But if you factor in those 100 people that were laid off and are making $0 an hour, at net balance, the wages tend to decline. And Hazlitt is actually correct about all of that. That when you're talking about a technological advancement would not be implemented in scale in any way unless there was a competitive advantage to be gained. The competitive advantage, again, is not a competitive advantage unless it gives you an advantage in competition in a market environment, which means that your productivity per net dollar and per net input, unit of input, must increase. It must give you that competitive advantage. In that case, again, everybody wins, and at net balance, either you've done something to reduce prices as a whole so that everyone's dollar goes further, or you've done something that has, in your case, actually increased productivity to a level that allows you to charge more, in which case what you wind up getting is more income for your employees and either a better product in exchange for that goods, for that currency, or again, some competitive advantage that allows you to sell it in effect at a lower cost. So everybody wins in that environment. This is not what we're talking about. We're talking about something that is arbitrary, something that is excised from the market environment. So there is one caveat I have to give to this read, and Hazlitt makes it in passing. I wish he would actually make it more clear. At the very end of the chapter, and what he calls as a postscript to this chapter, I should add that its argument is not directed against all tariffs. He does also make kind of a brief nod towards that in the beginning of the chapter, in the very first page of the chapter. But I don't think that he makes the exemption of war. And I don't know that that's necessarily the place for tariffs. For me, there is a time and a place for tariffs, embargoes, etc. And that place is as an element of negotiative leverage. In that case, yes, we are still going to pay for it. But if we go to China and say, listen, we are sick and tired of you doing this sort of thing, and we are so sick and tired of you doing this sort of thing, imprisoning Hong Kong residents for no reason, that we won't do business with you until you put an end to that practice. And we're so invested in this interest that we are willing to impose a tariff that is going to hurt us to get you to get your act together. It will hurt you too. And we're wealthy enough and we're willing enough to weather this storm. So that's a case where a tariff is, you're acknowledging that it's going to hurt you in the short run, but you're not using it for the purpose of the tariff. You're not using it because you think it's going to create an economic advantage for you. You're using it because you're willing to suffer through the economic disadvantage it's going to create. And even for me, I acknowledge that there may be other considerations to be made in politics that are not technically economical. There may be moral arguments, there may be ethical decisions to be made, and when it comes to political decisions that go beyond the world of strict economics. And there are plenty of places for those. We don't have to go over what all of them are. That actually should basically go over everything I was looking to talk about. I know I've gotten a bit long in the tooth here on the analysis and review part of this video. So he's going to actually continue in this series, which is the more complicated series on commodities and foreign exchange markets. In chapter 12, which is the drive for exports, which will be our next read in Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. So until then, this has been Mike, signing off.